Hi, and very welcome to Education for Future. I'm Eva Donnell and president of this non-profit organization, and we have a very special guest tonight in the form of Mr. Mark Collett. Very welcome, Mark.
It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
And I would like you to present yourself in order for it to be as correct as possible. I know you're very famous. And
I'd say probably more infamous than famous, but
well, that's also a way to become famous.
Well, my name's Mark Collett. I am now pushing 41 years of age, and for the last 2 decades, the vast majority of my adult life, I've been actively involved in ethnic nationalism. I've been a British nationalist, but more accurately, I describe myself as an ethno-nationalist. I believe that people of European descent are under great threat, and we are rapidly becoming a minority in our ancestral homelands, as well as in the lands that our forefathers founded. So all over the Western world, whether we are living in our ancestral homelands or in countries like America, New Zealand, or Australia, nations we founded, we are becoming a minority. And from my days at university, back at the turn of the millennium, I've been involved in nationalist politics. I was involved in the British National Party. I was their youth leader, then head of publicity. I was involved in their largest electoral wins. I designed the election material for those wins. And since then, I have become I was a YouTuber, but I'm now banned on YouTube. I work regularly with Dr. David Duke. I've spoken all over Europe, and with my friend and comrade Laura Towler, I run Patriotic Alternative, which is a nationalist group in the United Kingdom, and we campaign on numerous topics, and we are primarily a community-based campaigning group.
Could I ask you, what is your greatest achievement by now? Just to have 2 questions before your lecture starts.
I would say my greatest achievement to date is having a daughter. My greatest achievement is my little girl, Sophia.
Congratulations.
Thank you. But greatest political achievement would probably be, there's been several. I would say being involved in the election wins for the European Parliament for the British National Party, being involved in the electoral wins, the biggest council election wins that the British National Party had, and also designing the material for their electoral victory at the Greater London Assembly. That would be one major achievement. The other major achievement would have been beating the political system. I was arrested and charged for 8 counts of inciting racial hatred, and I was found unanimously not guilty by a jury over 2 trials. That was when I was a much younger man. That was, at the time, front page news in the UK and major news all over the world. We were expected to go to jail for up to 7 years for that, and we were found unanimously not guilty. And my other massive achievement, I would say, would be starting Patriotic Alternative, helping people to basically move away from the internet and move away from platforms like YouTube, Facebook, Instagram and Twitter into real world activity, because I was one of several people who could see that the writing was on the wall. I could see that these platforms weren't going to be there forever for us, and ultimately, if we were to succeed, we needed to basically ditch these platforms, build our own platforms, and start building real community bonds in the real world. And that, for me, is something that I continue to work towards to this day, because we can see that the internet, which was once seen as this blue ocean, this great opportunity whereby we could go with our message to the masses, it's becoming more and more regulated, and many people who are well known within our international community are now completely deplatformed. And if you are deplatformed and you do not have a real world organisation backing you up, then you end up being cut off from potentially tens or hundreds of thousands of supporters. And that was something very important. We launched PA as a life raft before the Great Purge came, before we got kicked off YouTube and Twitter. So that's something that's very, very important. And also, it's worth noting that real change does not come from just talking about things on YouTube. Real change comes from real world activity, and that is something that's very, very important for us.
Eva here again. This is a very, very hot topic. I hope you will dwell on that later on in your speech.
Well, I've written, obviously, you've asked me to talk about where things have gone wrong in the past and how we're trying to fix them. So what I've done, I haven't written a formal speech. I've written some bullet points about things I want to talk about. And I've split it into 2 45-minute segments. So I can get started whenever you want. But the first segment is about 3 failures that nationalists have been embroiled with in the past. And then the second 45 minutes is ways I think that we can learn from those failures and ways that we can fix what went wrong so we don't just end up repeating the same mistakes again and again and again.
Which is also very, very important, and the reason why we invited you, of course. But since you have so much interesting to say, let's get started, and let's hope that we, in the question session, can also bring up some things about the platforms, etc. So very welcome again, Mark, and please go ahead with the first part.
Okay, well, the first... We haven't quite got 45 minutes now, but I will try and condense it so we end at 1:45 so people can have a break. So I want to talk about where things went wrong, and I've got 3 examples. They're examples from the United Kingdom, they're examples you can look up, and you can go away from this and you can see how they might apply to things that have happened in your country, because I realise most of you guys aren't actually from here in the UK. Now, I will do this in a chronological order. I'll talk about these things in the order that they happened. And I'm going to talk about the 3 largest nationalist movements to have existed post-Second World War here in the UK and how they failed, or major reasons for their failings and why they aren't powerful and active today. The first is the National Front. Now, when I was involved in politics, I got involved with the British National Party. The National Front was already largely defeated by the time I got involved in politics. Now, the National Front is an interesting party in itself. It's interesting because it started off as something and became something different. And as it grew, interestingly, the tactics that caused it to grow initially eventually became the tactics that caused the party to collapse in on itself, that destroyed the National Front. Now, I don't know if any of you guys have heard of an American nationalist called Dr. William Pierce. Dr. William Pierce is quite famous. He used to do a daily radio show, but he also used to edit a newspaper which went through several different iterations and name changes. The newspaper at one point was called National Vanguard, then it was called just Vanguard, and then eventually it was called Attack. Now, or in some order, if I've mixed that up in some way, my apologies. But when I got involved in the British National Party, they used to sell books, and one of the books that I bought was actually a huge, huge book. In fact, it's not really a book, it's a compendium of the best articles from Dr. William Pierce's papers. And I was leafing through this and I was reading them, because some of them are actually good intellectual articles and some of them were actually very important articles, which are now quite dated, but are a bit of a time capsule to how nationalism used to be at different times. And as I was flicking through this book, or compendium, I came across a very, very interesting article, and it was actually about Britain's National Front. And the article was saying that Britain's National Front was the largest, at the time of writing, pro-white or racialist political party in the world, one of, if not the best organised. And indeed, through the 1970s, at its peak, the National Front had 20,000 members. Now, I don't know how many people it had as supporters, how many people on its mailing list, but it had 20,000 paid-up members. It was Britain's fourth largest political party. And when I looked at this article, when I read this article in this in this reprint of old William Pierce papers, I was very, very interested to see his take on the National Front. And he wrote a glowing report on how well-dressed people were, how well-presented they were, how great the National Front was. And it had a picture of a National Front march. Now, the National Front grew via a method that they called march and grow. Now, march and grow was an interesting tactic. What the National Front did is they would pick a town or a city where there was some kind of ethnic problem or there was something newsworthy that the National Front wanted to address, and they would announce a march in that town or city at the weekend, and thousands, and this is what William Pierce was very impressed about, thousands of very well-dressed people in suits, shirts and ties, all looking fantastic, with banners and placards, would go to that town or city, and they would march through it as a show of force. And naturally, people in that town and city would be pretty impressed by this. This was very well-dressed, normal people, ex-servicemen, people of good standing in society, very smart, as I said, really, really good optics. People were blown away by this, and the National Front grew very rapidly via this march and grow tactic. But, and this is strange, march and grow became march and shrink. It became march and die. And ultimately what they used to grow themselves ended up being the method by which they were defeated. So initially these marches were very, very well attended, with thousands upon thousands, and I mean thousands of normal people. And these people, as I said, were very smartly dressed, decent, normal, working people you would want to be associated with, people who would attract other people into the movement. And these shows of force were fantastic. And the media had no choice. The media wouldn't like it, but they had no choice to cover it because they were so big. And when they did cover it, the images were so good, people would want to get involved. So how did march and grow end up becoming march and shrink? Well, march and shrink began when the left realised that they could attack these marches. So, as the marches were always advertised well in advance, so people could make their way there via public transport or sharing cars, or get time off work the day before if they wanted to travel down and stop over, the left realised that they could rally their numbers, and pretty soon any town or city that had a scheduled National Front march would end up with thousands of leftists, of sort of Antifa. They weren't called Antifa back then, they were called the Anti-Nazi League, but thousands of Anti-Nazi League supporters would descend upon this town or city. And then what happened? Well, you would end up with the march, which attempted to be peaceful with lots of normal, decent people on it. The march had to be protected by the police, and leftist mobs organised the other side of the police and would hurl bricks, fruit, vegetables, other missiles at the marchers. And there would always be outbreaks of violence. So now the public didn't actually see the march, because all the public could see was a mass of anti-Nazi League supporters, Socialist Worker Party members, other leftists, unionists, throwing things over a sea of police into the marchers. And over time, this caused many people who would go to the National Front marches to stop going. So a lot of the decent people stopped going. The media would then show pictures of the violence. The public couldn't actually see the march or interact with people on the march or get leaflets from people on the march. So there was no direct interaction anymore between the people attending the march and the general public. And things started to turn sour. But the National Front didn't learn from this, and they didn't change. And they said, and rightly so in some ways, they said, it is our right to march. It's our right to go to towns and cities and raise issues to do with immigration and multiculturalism and other such threats to our ethnic group. But the problem was, as the marches continued and as the violence escalated, the normal people that I spoke of earlier, the normal people that I saw in this news clipping from years and years ago in this compendium piece, they stopped attending. And it became a self-selecting process whereby the more normal people who left, the higher the concentration became of skinheads, of people who wanted violence, of people who were going to the march because there would be violence, people who wanted to fight, and over time, it became that the National Front and those on the National Front marches were very rough and ready. They were very ready for the violence. In fact, they were turning up for that, many of them. Many of them were attracted to the scene because they knew they would be getting their hands dirty on the march. So the marches stopped being a spectacle of how the National Front were normal, decent, acceptable, palatable people, and became a spectacle of violence and thuggery, and the media loved it. So not only were the public not being able to interact with the march, but the march wasn't any longer anything that the public would want to interact with. So March and Grow became March and Shrink. The National Front became associated with violence, with skinhead gangs, with town centres and city centres being shut down for a whole Saturday while this violence took place. And eventually there was a march, a pivotal march through Lewisham, and this march in Lewisham was an absolute disaster for the National Front. And this was one of the reasons why the National Front went from being Britain's fourth biggest party with 20,000 members to collapsing, and eventually it gave birth to the British National Party. Now, this takes us on to another nationalist failing. Now, the British National Party didn't go down the route of, well, initially it went down the route of marching. It tried to do the same thing, but with a new, clean name, with a name that was a fresh start. But eventually, the British National Party learned from the National Front. They learned from the National Front and they put an end to all of their marches. So there was no further marching from the British National Party. And the British National Party then began to advance through what was known as the electoral route. So the British National Party started going after elections, and that meant the British National Party didn't get involved in violence anymore, because if you're participating in elections, if you're turning up with a car of four of you with some leaflets and you're knocking on doors, you're putting leaflets through letterboxes, you park up somewhere, you go and do your political activity, you leave, and all of a sudden there was none of these violent spectacles. What ended up happening was the party grew, and the party grew because it wasn't engaged in violence and bad optics anymore. But anyone who is astute or knows nationalist history will say, but Mark, the British National Party isn't really active today. And I said earlier, the National Front had at its peak around 20,000 members, maybe just over 20,000 members. Today it has fewer than 100. And the British National Party at its peak had around 14,500 members. And now it has, I believe, fewer than 400. So what went wrong? Well, the British National Party wisely avoided these big marches. The British National Party wisely avoided the march and shrink strategy that killed the National Front. But unfortunately, the British National Party wedded itself. There's many problems, but this is one of them. The British National Party wedded itself very, very closely to the electoral cycle. Now, I call it the electoral cycle because there is a cycle. Elections take place in the UK every May, and generally between May and September not very much happens. So they take place the first Thursday in May, and then the rest of May, June, July, August, virtually nothing happens politically. Then things start to heat up. September comes, October comes, November comes, and by the time you get to January, election talk is happening again, and then February, March, April is fever pitch, and then obviously election day comes, first Thursday of May again. So there is a cycle in terms of a yearly cycle. But elections also move in cycles of boom and bust for different parties. So parties will do very well. They will boom for a period, and then the public tends to tire of them, or conditions change, or there are new issues that come to the fore, and another party will boom, and the party that used to be in power or used to be doing well will go through a bust period. So there is the yearly electoral cycle, and then there is the boom and bust cycle of politics. So at the moment here in the UK, if you follow UK politics, the boom and bust cycle is favouring the Conservative Party. The boom and bust cycle is Boris Johnson is booming, whereas Keir Starmer and the Labour Party, well, they have gone bust. But when I say they've gone bust, that's probably a little bit over the top. Now, Labour have had one of the most punishing defeats they've ever had. Earlier this month, actually, we had what was called Super Thursday, which was a massive number of elections on the same day, and Labour were the big losers. But when I say they were the big losers, they still emerged with, I think they've got over 200 parliamentary seats still. So they're still the official opposition in Parliament. They still control dozens of councils. They still have thousands and thousands of councillors. They still control the Welsh Assembly. They still have seats in the GLA, they control the London mayoralty, and although they're not in power and they're seen as being in a bust period, they still have a massive, massive amount of representation. Now, that's because they have what's called gravity. The bigger and more powerful a party becomes, the more gravity it has. And I'm sure you understand what I mean by gravity. The bigger and heavier a planet, the more gravity it has and the more things it pulls into itself. So if you're flying around a planet the size of Saturn, it's harder to escape its gravitational field than if you're flying around our moon, because our moon is very small and has a smaller gravitational field. Now, it's the same with political parties. The bigger they are and the more power they get, the more likely they are to hold on to their members. The more likely it is that when they go into a bust period, they won't completely break down. Now, a small party doesn't have that gravity. It doesn't have the power to hold people in. It's not achieved its critical mass. So boom and bust periods for small parties are much, much more troubling. And this is what you saw in the British National Party. Now, I first got involved in the British National Party in the year 2000. And in 2001, or was it 2002? It might have been 2002. The British National Party, it is 20 years ago, so forgive me if I haven't got the exact dates right. But the British National Party got its first 3 councillors elected in Burnley. And the following year, the British National Party... yes, it was 2002 because I stood in an election and I voted. Yeah, it was 2002. And then the following year, the British National Party won 2 by-elections in quick succession. They won one in Blackburn, a guy called Robin Evans, and one in Halifax, and the guy's name was Adrian Marsden. So the BNP all of a sudden had 5 councillors, and it started to boom. And all of a sudden, the party grew. It was big news. And it was enjoying a boom in the electoral cycle. This was a boom. So lots of people poured in. And this boom continued up until the year 2004. Now, in 2004, what happened? Well, 2004, it was the European elections. And the British National Party were hotly tipped to win at least 1 seat. But there was a big change in the way elections were run that year, which didn't favour the BNP. Everything was moved to postal votes as an experiment, and this actually led to an increased turnout, which caused the BNP not to win any seats. Now, this was my first hands-on experience of the boom and bust cycle. So the party was growing from 2001 to this crescendo in 2004 when we were meant to get seats in the European Parliament. And the BNP fell short. And I can tell you this now. The bust period that followed the 2004 Euro election failure was terrible. People left the party, they were depressed, and the party didn't have the gravity to hold them there. It didn't have hundreds of MPs, it didn't have thousands of councillors, it didn't have huge head offices all over the country and jobs for people. It fractured, people were laid off, people left, branches shrank, people lost faith in the BNP. And we lost lots of people. And going into 2005, where there was a general election, it was pretty grim for the BNP. Now, what actually held the BNP together in those times, and I mentioned this earlier, was actually the arrests of myself and the then leader. And it was the publicity surrounded that kept donations coming in, that kept people following the BNP in the news. But the BNP, off the back of that, began to boom again in 2006. And it boomed big. And I mean big. Now, I designed some leaflets for a guy called Richard Barnbrook. Me and him worked on those. He actually visited me and we spent a whole few days just working on nothing but these leaflets. And these leaflets went all out over Barking and Dagenham. And the BNP got 12 councillors elected in Barking and Dagenham in one electoral cycle and went from being a party with zero representation to a party which was the official opposition. And all of a sudden, as I said, boom and bust is cycles. There was another massive boom for the British National Party, and this boom followed elsewhere in the country. There were councillors elected in other places, and people were getting really, really excited. And this boom continued right up to 2008. And in 2008, Richard Barnbrook was elected to the Greater London Assembly. It was the first time the British National Party had a major win. We were actually elected to a regional assembly and had what was not the equivalent of a parliamentary seat, but the next tier down. This was massive. And then in 2009, the momentum continued. And we got 2 MEPs elected, one in Yorkshire and one in the Northwest. So now the party had 56 councillors. It had hundreds of parish councillors. It had a county councillor. It had a GLA member, and it had 2 MEPs. And then the 2010 general election came, and that was the bust. The Conservative Party got in. Often when the Conservative Party comes in, that's bad for nationalists. When a right-wing party comes in, it's bad for nationalism. When a left-wing party's in, that's good for nationalism. People often then will vote nationalist as a protest against that. So we're seeing this boom and bust cycle. And when the bust came in 2010, the party fractured and people left en masse. And unfortunately, the BNP went, as I said earlier, from 14,500 members, and it now has fewer than 400 to this day. So both the National Front we've discussed and the British National Party, and both were destroyed for different reasons. The National Front because of the March and Grow strategy, and the British National Party because it was wedded to this electoral cycle. Now, I'm not saying, and I'll discuss this in the second half, that we shouldn't stand in elections. We should stand in elections, and we should use elections for our own good. But what I'm saying is, if you double down and make the electoral cycle the be-all and end-all, as a small party, it is very difficult to survive the boom and bust cycles. Big parties can survive it because they have gravity. Little parties, they don't have the gravity. They can't survive it. And you've seen that with UKIP as well. UKIP ended up being far bigger than the British National Party, but still a small party, still not the massive representation, not the massive amounts of money, not the massive offices and internal structure that you need for real gravity. UKIP today has gone from being a party that actually won a whole national election, which was the European elections in 2014. They won that outright, to being a party with, I don't think they've got any elected officials. They might have 1 or 2 councillors nationwide, but they've seen a party doing an unprecedented, achieving a unprecedented feat of winning an entire national election to having nobody, literally no one other than the odd backwater councillor. They're finished. And at the recent GLA election, I believe their mayoral candidate ended up with something like 0.1% of the vote. So small, it just embarrassing. And this is a party that once won an entire national election. So the electoral cycle and being too closely wedded to that boom and bust cycle was what damaged the British National Party and ultimately what helped to rip it apart. Now, there were other factors. There were financial factors. There was accusations of corruption. There was fallouts internally. But many of those factors were also linked to that 2010 massive electoral defeat at the general election, where the British National Party basically got very poor results and never recovered. Lost all their MEPs in 2014, didn't win their seat back at the GLA. In fact, the GLA candidate went independent. One of their MEPs went independent. Most of their councillors either resigned or went independent before they went up for election. It just shattered the party, shattered morale. So first thing we learnt is big marches and march and grow doesn't really work. And secondly, what also doesn't work is being solely or too heavily wedded to the electoral cycle. So that's two big nationalist movements. The National Front, which was in existence from the 1960s, its heyday was in the 1970s. It collapsed post-1979, but still exists to this day in small numbers. We've moved on to the British National Party, which was formed in the very early 1980s. It took till the late 1990s, around 1999, year 2000, to really gather steam. Its heyday was between the years 2002 or 2001 at a push up to 2010. It then collapsed again, tiny. So what replaced the British National? Because there's always something that replaces the previous nationalist party. What replaced the British National Party? Well, you may be familiar with this guy. His name's Tommy Robinson. He's what would be described as a street activist. Some would call him a football lad, a football hooligan. He's a guy who campaigns against Islam. Now, he's not a political party, but he led a street movement which was known as the EDL, the English Defence League. And the English Defence League, they really did boom at one point. Another organisation that boomed. And at their height, they had, at one of their demos, over 10,000 people in attendance. So that's a massive achievement. To have over 10,000 people at a street demonstration is very, very impressive. And I'm not taking that away from them. So why aren't they here today? Well, the EDL had a similar strategy to March and Grow. Now, they were what was called a street movement. And it's very important to say these people were not ethno-nationalists. The BNP and the National Front were ethno-nationalists. They believed that ethnicity is important, that race and nation are, inseparable. They are wedded to one another. But the EDL didn't believe that. They're not ethno-nationalists. Now, they had very large demos, but their demos had several problems. Firstly, their demos were seen by their members as days out. They weren't seen as political activities. Now, we talked earlier about the British National Party. The British National Party's electioneering was definitely seen as a political activity. The National Front's marches were seen as political activities. They were to build an actual political party, and the National Front did stand in elections, but its primary modus operandi was marching rather than electioneering. But the EDL, they weren't trying to build a party. They weren't trying to build a structured organisation. The EDL was a street movement, a movement of demonstrations. And sadly, many of their members or supporters saw those demonstrations not as political activities, but as a good day out. So that brought with it a number of problems. And those problems usually related around alcohol, drugs, and violence. So people would get on the megabus and they'd get their cheap bus ticket down, or if they had a bit more money, they'd jump on the train and they'd be there with their mates, or if they were an organised branch, they'd hire a big coach just for their branch, and they'd all be on the coach or the megabus or the train from 7 a.m, and they'd have their big crate of high-strength lager, all their white powder that they all enjoyed, or many, not all of them, but many of them enjoyed sniffing, and they would take it as they would take something like a football match. So they'd all be getting drunk, they'd all be getting leery, they'd all be getting very animated. And on the way down to these demos, there would be a party-like atmosphere. But having a party-like atmosphere at 9 a.m. in the morning often leads to total disaster by about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And these demos were often the worst spectacles of nationalism. They were people who were at the demo, they were drunk, they were often swearing, they would always rise to the bait of the media, the police, the Antifa. They had the same problem as March and Go in the sense that they announced their arrival beforehand. They would say, we are having a demonstration in this particular city on this day, so the left knew to be there. And as their demonstrations waned in number, as fewer and fewer people turned up to these demonstrations because of the violence, the left began growing in number proportionally and the violence flared. Now, the problem with the EDL demos is people thought that was the be-all and end-all. So they wanted a good day out, they had their cans of lager, they were sat on the bus with their friends, heading down for the demo. It was all a good laugh, it was all a good giggle, everyone having a good time, sing-song on the bus. They'd get down for the demo, they'd shout and scream at the police, they'd shout and scream at the left, they'd have a few more beers, they'd stop at a pub, have a few more beers, they'd head back, they'd get home, they'd wake up the next day with a sore head, and they would believe that politics was done. That was it. They'd done their bit, they'd helped do whatever they thought they were helping with, which was obviously raising awareness or adding numbers to a demo, but really there wasn't any organisation. Whereas the National Front and the BNP had an organisation and a structure, the EDL just made people feel good for a day. It made people feel like they'd done their bit, when in fact there hadn't been any sort of tangible change or gain from that political activity. So that was one of the problems. Now, the other problem was the bad optics, was the fallouts, was the violence, was the drinking. And we've seen this. I mean, very recently we saw an episode where a group of ex-EDL, Football Lads Alliance and other guys went to London. Now, they went down there to protect statues from the Black Lives Matter group. And what did you see? Well, the police did treat them very, very unfairly. But you also saw a complete lack of discipline. You saw a complete lack of order. You saw people hurling cans of beer at the police. You saw people urinating in public. You saw people being sick. You saw people so drunk that they couldn't find their way back to the station or the bus depot, getting attacked and picked off by the left. These events were very, very chaotic. They weren't very well organised. And the point of them, well, I'm not sure what the point of them was, because the National Front, it had a point. The idea was that you march through the town, it was a spectacle of smart, decent people. Normal people would see that, they'd say, I want to get involved. They'd inquire to the party would put them in touch with a local organiser. You marched, you grew. That was the mindset, that was why they did it. The EDL, on the other hand, or these football lad organisations, these sort of one-off big boozy demonstrations, there's no real way to get in touch. There's no real way to get on board afterwards. There's no organisation. There's no structure. There's no way of managing any growth that there could be. And these demonstrations always brought out the worst in people. Now, I am sure many of you have seen footage from these demonstrations, footage of people being interviewed at these demonstrations, footage of people reacting to the left. Now, I'm not saying the left have a right to throw missiles at anybody, they certainly don't, but when you are representing a nationalist group, you have to do your best to keep you cool. You have to do your best to present your group as disciplined, ordered, smart. And if you're walking down the street with a case of lager on your shoulder, a can of lager in your hand, and when you finish drinking half of it, you're lobbing it over the heads of police officers to hopefully hit some leftist in the head, that gives the media everything they wanted. And I said at the beginning, the EDL had an incredible demonstration. Their peak numbers was actually over 10,000 people. I think that was actually in Newcastle, but they rapidly fell off in number. And all subsequent EDL style demos have ended up in this kind of drunken, boozy, bizarre madness where it's very, very embarrassing. And those who stick around after these demos, they carry on their lack of discipline. And often you see videos on YouTube or videos on other file sharing sites of people doing scandalous things when they've had too many to drink, or talking about using certain banned substances, which they certainly shouldn't be using. So the EDL and these other street movements collapsed in the same way that the BNP and the National Front collapsed, but they collapsed for other reasons. And during that collapse, they didn't really build anything of note. And not only didn't they build anything of note, but they actually damaged the wider nationalist movement. Whereas the National Front started off smart, the National Front started off in suit, shirts and ties. The British National Party went on to estates, again often in suit, shirts and ties, because we were knocking on doors and we were actually speaking to people and we were trying to present ourselves as the best. The EDL didn't really even present themselves as the best. It presented itself in a way that was largely negative and had all of the negative trappings of the former March and Grow strategy. So the EDL ended up being another disaster. And now I think the EDL does still exist, just like the BNP and just like the National Front. The EDL does still exist, but it is a tiny, tiny organisation, and it's the last few marches, or last few EDL marches, I think they struggled to get over 100 people. So you're talking about events that once attracted in excess of 10,000 people, now struggling to get a few hundred in attendance. So what have you seen here so far? This first 45 minutes, it's flown past, but I'm going to do a quick summation before we go to the first break. You've seen 3 different nationalist organisations. You have seen 3 different ways of going about politics. You've seen 3 different ways that these nationalist organisations have tried to grow. And you've seen all of them reach impressive peaks, but then you've seen them all collapse very, very rapidly. You've seen their numbers drop off to a mere fraction of their peak. You've seen them going from being headline-dominating organisations to being organisations that are just rumps of what they were and aren't even really worth reporting on. And they become what I call zombie parties. Now, if you understand what a zombie is kind of a creature from a horror film. It's neither dead nor alive, but it's not alive, but it's not dead. It was once alive, but it's been injured to the point where it's now no longer alive, but it's not dead. It's sort of just shambling along, sort of this bizarre walking corpse, sort of a perverse approximation of what it once was when it's alive. And I call these organisations zombie movements or zombie parties. They are still alive, but they're not really alive. And they're not dead because they are still there, but they're definitely not alive. They're sort of just shambling along like a sort of bizarre walking corpse, a bizarre perverse vision of what it once was. So if you looked at the National Front today, you certainly wouldn't see thousands of men in suit, shirts and ties walking down the street. Last time there was a National Front march in Britain, I think there was about 15 people there. The British National Party once had MEPs. I don't think they even stood any seats in the recent council election. They might have stood one or two at most. And they used to stand slates of hundreds, sort of 600-700 council seats would stand. So all of these groups have shrunk, and it's the same with the EDL. You simply don't see them anymore, and if you do, it's a tiny, tiny number. They're not what they once were. But all of these parties adopted different strategies. They all had inherent flaws in their strategies. March and Grow became March and Shrink. The electoral cycle was this boom and bust roller coaster that a small party, if it got too closely wedded to, would just be shaken to pieces and destroyed. That was the fate of the BNP. And the EDL based their demonstrations around drunkenness, around loutish behaviour, and tolerated all manner of things. Now, they're not ethno-nationalists, but all manner of things that I would not want wedded to nationalism. I don't want guys turning up at PA meetings with bags of white powder. I don't want people drunk at our meetings. I don't want people coming to our meetings or events looking for trouble, looking for a politically incorrect diversion, a bit of a thrill, a bit of a day out where we can throw some cans, sing some songs, go home and think we've done our bit. But that was the EDL, and because that was their modus operandi, they are no longer with us. Now, in the second half, what I'm going to do is taking what I've said just now about those three failures. I'm going to talk a little bit about Patriotic Alternative, and I'm going to talk about the way that I think we as nationalists can learn from the National Front, the British National Party and the EDL, and how we can build an organisation that avoids those pitfalls, and how we can structure an organisation so that we don't end up repeating the mistakes of the past.
Thank you so much, Mark. So let's take a 10-minute break.
För er som uppskattar Education for Futures arbete för yttrandefriheten får ni gärna donera en slant till 123 323 3111.
I think we should continue with the very interesting part number 2.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That was a good little break. I have slightly recharged myself, so here goes with part number 2. So obviously the first part we talked about things that have gone wrong, and we talked about 3 different groups, each which employed a different tactic. One was marching, one was demonstrations, and one was being wedded to the electoral cycle. And each one of those organisations failed, and each one of those tactics didn't work out. Now, it's very important when you're talking about tactics that you don't just throw the baby out with the bathwater. You can still use something from an organisation that didn't get it right. They might have got some things right, but the overall mix of what they did went wrong. So you can learn things. And what you learn doesn't just have to be ignoring their tactics completely. You can look at those organisations and say to yourself, well, actually, they didn't win and they did fail, but if they'd have done things slightly differently, if we slightly changed the way they did things back then, they might still be here today. And I think that that's what we can do. I think that we can learn from these organisations, both the National Front, the EDL, and the British National Party. I think we can learn from all 3 of those. They were all very successful in their day in different ways. And I think we can take the best bits of each of those and use those best bits to create something better, something more stable, and something which will have longevity. Because that's what we need. We need an organisation that is going to stand up for the interests of people of European descent. And we need that organisation to be something that is strong, that is effective, that doesn't get caught in different traps, that isn't mired with violence, that isn't mired with the kind of spectacles you saw later on in the National Front or with the EDL, and that isn't just wedded to the electoral cycle, so the first time the party doesn't win a slate of councillors, it's game over. We need an organisation that does something more. And when I started Patriotic Alternative with Laura Towler, I had a vision. And my vision was fixing nationalism. It was building an organisation that had a broad base, that focused on multiple things at the same time, and essentially focused on community building first and foremost. It didn't focus on big shows of power. It didn't focus on marches. It didn't focus on confronting the Reds or the left. It didn't focus solely on elections. It focused on community first. Because I believe that both power and stability comes from a community. And if you build a community, a genuine community where people have strong bonds, where people get on with one another, where people view each other as more than just political allies, as more than just people they go leafleting with, I believe that group is more likely to be able to weather the storm. So let's talk a bit about this. So we'll start with the National Front because that's where we started in the first section. Now, the National Front, as we said, employed march and grow. Now, marching only works if you have overwhelming numbers. So I like analogies, and people who watch my shows, people who watch my presentations or listen to my speeches often see that I employ analogies, and I often use this analogy. Think of us as the small guys. Think of us as the ragtag bunch of guerrilla fighters facing a much more numerous and better organised enemy. And our enemies are greater in number, and they have much better organisation, much better funding, and they are in lockstep with the state and the establishment. So when you see the left, if you see the left as our enemies on a march, if you see those as the people that will attack us and we will have to fight, well, they are, but at the same time, they're supported by the banks. They're supported by the trade unions. They're supported by the Labour Party. They might not be supported by the Conservative Party so vigorously, but the Conservative Party will never condemn them. And if there's a fight between a nationalist group and a left-wing group, the Conservative Party will always condemn the nationalists, and they won't really say anything about the leftist group. So these leftist groups are, in military terms, greater in number, much better armed, much better funded, and in many ways better trained. So, what do we do? Well, in the past, as we saw with the National Front, there's been this suicidal tendency where nationalists will say to their enemies, think of it like, as I said, like a military engagement. The nationalists will be, right, we shall meet you on this particular field, on this particular day, and the battle shall start at 11 a.m. Now, if you're smaller in number, that is the most stupid way of conducting warfare. You are going to die. Think of the Viet Cong. If the Vietnamese had said to the Americans, right, we're going to meet you in this rice field on this day for a big battle, a big show of force, the Vietnam War would have been over as soon as that battle had ended. By the time that battle had ended, by the time the smoke had cleared and the bodies were being dragged out of the mud, the Vietnam War would have been over and the Viet Cong would have been defeated. So how did the Viet Cong end up defeating the entire might of the American industrial complex? Well, they defeated the American industrial complex because they didn't fight a conventional war. They used guerrilla tactics. They dug tunnels. They popped out unexpectedly. They laid ambushes, they laid traps, they captured American service personnel. And I know this is only a film, but it's a good film. Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket. Now, I hope you've all seen this, because if you haven't, I'm going to ruin it for you. The first half of the film shows the training that American Marines went through, and the second half shows what happened when those Marines ended up in Vietnam, and showed how it didn't really work out for the Marines and how their training, their conventional training, didn't actually help them when fighting a guerrilla army. And at the end, there is a battle, or what you think is a battle. And an entire squad of Marines gets pinned down, killed, grievously wounded, and you're thinking, this must be an impressive force of Viet Cong guerrilla fighters. And the big twist at the end is it isn't. It's one Viet Cong soldier, and it's a female. It's one slim, tiny built Viet Cong soldier with a sniper rifle. And she's pinned down this entire squad of US Marines. You know, they've had to pull in tanks, they've had to flatten buildings to get this one sniper. And it shows how asymmetric warfare can allow a smaller, far less well-trained, far less well-funded, far less well-armed force basically defeat a much better armed, a much more numerate force. And that's what we have to think like. We are the small guys. We don't have the establishment on our side. We don't have the media. We don't have the trade unions. We don't have political parties like the Labour Party or the Conservatives. We don't have big money donors. When we take donations, and I am grateful for every donation I receive, but we take $5, $10, £3. You know, if a big donation for us is $200, £200. For these leftist groups, a sizable donation would be £100,000. These groups get funded by government money to the tune of millions. You have groups in the UK, these anti-racist groups, and the Trinity Mirror Group will give them $250,000 to fund them to stop us. We don't have that money. We don't have those big name donors. So we're not funded. Our people know that if they turn up and they put their face out there, they will be doxxed. They might lose their job. They might be attacked. They might have their car smashed up. The left don't get that. The left can turn up and throw bricks all day and the media won't even take pictures of their faces. And if their faces are seen on the news, the police will say no crime has been committed and won't arrest them. We've seen this before. So our numbers are fewer. We don't receive the same funding. We don't receive any state support. The police do not back us. The police will arrest us for carrying out acts of self-defense. So March and Grow doesn't work. We cannot turn around and dictate the battlefield. This isn't the English Civil War where the battlefield was predetermined, the fight would begin at 11 a.m. and the victors would be the ones who won fair and square via military tactics, or the military tactics which are accepted for the day. We have to think, and this is an analogy, I'm not saying anyone should commit any acts of violence or no one should go and sit in a tower block with a rifle like some Viet Cong sniper. We have to think like a political guerrilla force. We can't put our members at risk. We can't put our organisation at risk. We can't dictate the terms of the battle. And we can't do that until we get critical mass. Now, if the day comes when we are wildly successful and we get 250,000 people saying we're all going to go to London on the same day and march through the streets and say, no, we want an end to mass immigration, then that is the time to do that. But until we have those numbers, it's guerrilla tactics. And I know what people will say. People will say, Mark, and they've said this to me before, we should be proud of this. We should announce our intentions and we should turn up and we should keep turning up and we should keep turning up until we're beaten into the ground and then we should turn up again because that's what brave, decent, honest... No, that's rhetoric. That's making a speech. That's not thinking. That's sending your men to repeated defeat and repeated failure for your ego. That's complete hubris and nonsense. It is the time of the political guerrilla activity. So we learn from the National Front, political guerrilla activities. Secondly, what do we learn from the British National Party? Well, we learn from the British National Party that if you build an organisation around the boom and bust electoral cycle, eventually you will go bust. And when you go bust, if you don't have the gravity, which you won't have because you're a small, underfunded nationalist organisation, your members will leave. What did I learn from the British National Party? I'll give you 2 lessons. One lesson is called Steve, and one lesson is called Paul. Steve is a guy that I met. He came to my house to pick up some leaflets. At first, he thought I was a bit of a hard-liner and wasn't too impressed with me, but he learned to like me. And we started talking about numerous things. Now, Steve likes mountain biking and outdoor pursuits, and I like mountain biking and outdoor pursuits. And it wasn't long before me and Steve had actually become quite good friends. And I was visiting Steve regularly through my time in the British National Party. And we would go biking, we would go walking, we'd go hiking, we would go target shooting, do all sorts of stuff together. And he'd come over to my house, and when he came to my house, we'd go out, we'd have a few drinks, we'd go to a nice restaurant, do lots of things. So when I went to his, we did certain things. When we came to mine, we did certain things, and we'd go camping together and do things like that. And do you know what? I still go mountain biking with Steve. I still go camping with Steve. I still know Steve to this day. Why do I still know Steve? Because although we both were involved in politics, and we both went leafleting together on dozens and dozens of occasions, we had more in common than just leafleting. And then I met a guy called Paul, and myself and Paul met, and he said, "Do you play Street Fighter 2? And I said, "Mate, I love old Nintendo games." So me and Paul sat down and we played some Nintendo games and we started talking and we became very, very good friends. And again, we went out leafleting dozens of times together. We attended a myriad of political meetings. He even worked briefly for the British National Party in my office when I ran an office for the party. And to this day, I still play computer games with Paul, just as I still go biking with Steve. And they're people that I've known respectively for, well, with Steve, I've known him since 2001, so coming up to 2 decades. And with Paul, I've known him from 2007. So, again, 14 years, pushing 15 years. So, long time to be friends with people. And we share the same views. They're still nationalists. They're still involved in politics. And I'm still friends with them. But why am I friends with Paul and Steve and not friends with other people who I knew back in the BNP days? It's because I had something more in common with Paul and Steve. Whereas with other people, all we had in common was that we disagreed with mass immigration and we wanted to put leaflets out. And then when the boom came, we all stood shouting and cheering and celebrating our wins. And when the bust came, there was no reason for us to call each other anymore. They went their way, I went my way, and I'll probably never see them again. But at one time, they were my friends. Well, more comrades. But they weren't proper friends, and that's really the point. So what do we learn there? We learn that nationalist parties should use elections when it is expedient for them to do so. If there is a parliamentary by-election in an area where there's been problems with immigration or problems with grooming gangs or something that nationalism can seize upon and get a good result, stand in that election, get a good result, get good publicity, and put one in the eye for the system. If there's council seats that we can genuinely win with community campaigns, we should do that. But we shouldn't be aiming to stand 650 parliamentary seats in the UK just for the sake of it, burning through millions of pounds and then averaging 2.1% across the country, losing our deposits, going bust, and the party shattering. Now, I spoke earlier about friendship, and you might be thinking, why am I telling you about my friends? Because when we started Patriotic Alternative, I said it was a community-based party. And yes, we are trying to become a registered political party, and we do want to stand in elections, but we are community-based. Now, you might see us doing different things. And we do different things in the real world, and we do different things on a Sunday night. What do we do on a Sunday night? Well, on a Sunday night, we have our book club, where we review books. We have our gaming tournaments, where we all play computer games together. And we have our film club, where we all watch a film, and then we review it as a group, and people in the chat talk about the film. We also have a fitness group, we have hiking groups, we had a baking competition, and I know what my detractors will say. They'll say, "Mark, none of that's politics, why are you wasting your time?" And my answer to those people is, you're completely wrong. All of those things are politics, and that is why we engage with them. Our enemies are not only better funded than us, they not only have more in terms of numbers, people who will actually turn up. They're not only supported by the establishment more than us, but in many ways, they've actually played their hand in a much more intelligent manner than we have. They understand that all of these things are politics. That's why when you go on Facebook, you see baking groups with BLM stickers. That's why You buy a computer game today, and if it's updated on a weekly basis with new content, you'll see political slogans in it at certain times of the year. That's why every film being made pushes a political narrative. That's why even people who collect Warhammer 40k tabletop gaming figures are having political correctness pushed on them. It's because all of these things are political. Everything is political in some way, whether it's fishing, mountain biking, fitness, it doesn't matter. And we have to get our people connecting with each other on a deeper level. But we also have to fight on a cultural level. We also have to take our fight to this cultural battleground. We have to reach out to people who are into films, into games, into baking, into fitness. And I can tell you now, I'm not on YouTube anymore, but I do still watch YouTube videos. And there are dozens of massive channels with people of all ages complaining about political correctness in films. Are we going to ignore that? Or are we going to talk about it, reach out to those people and say, hey, we're just like you. We love films. We love the art of filmmaking. We love that scene in The Godfather where Michael Corleone is at the baptism and it all unfolds and you're like, wow, this is the great... Are you like that too? Wow, yeah. But don't you really hate how all these new films have... Oh, you do hate how new films have political correctness in them. Oh, we're just like you, but we have an organisation that represents us and helps us fight back against political correctness. Oh, you play computer games. You've been playing them for years, but you don't like the fact they've changed all the white characters in Call of Duty to multi-ethnic characters, and now there's a 7-stone wet-through woman throwing 15-stone guys over her shoulder and shouting girl power. You don't like that. Well, we don't like that either. We don't like that feminism, and we think feminism is deeply anti-white, it's anti-male, and we've got a group that represents us, and we play games together, but we also talk about politics. And you can see where I'm going with this. It can be applied to everything. But when you apply this, it's not dry. It's not boring. Saying to people, come out and put leaflets through letterboxes is dry and boring. It can only happen so many times before they get bored. But if you connect with those people, you will have a deeper understanding of them. You'll build a genuine community, and you are less likely to lose touch with those people because you're actually friends with them. And that's why I'm still friends with Paul and Steve. And it's why I'm not friends with lots of other people who I never really got to know, because the BNP didn't do very many community-orientated pieces of work. It was far too wedded to that boom and bust electoral cycle. So when it went bust, people left with their tail between their legs and they didn't call each other anymore. Because when there wasn't leafleting to do, when there wasn't canvassing to do, when there wasn't the jubilation of we've got 2 new councillors, now let's go to the neighbouring ward and put out new leaflets, they had no reason to turn up anymore. And it lost the party tens of thousands of members. And that's why it's got fewer than 400 people involved today. But it's why Patriotic Alternative grows. It's why when you see us at weekends, we aren't just doing what political parties do. We're not just putting leaflets through doors. I can tell you now, coming up to this weekend, there will be people leafleting, but there will be people hiking. There will be people camping. There will be people doing fitness groups. There will be people doing a book review. I could pick up my phone now and show you Telegram groups with hundreds and hundreds of young lads who used to be completely isolated from one another and didn't actually have friends in the movement. But they do now. Why? Because we had a Warzone tournament and we said, get involved, join a random team, make friends with the guys on your team. That game has got 150 players. We had 110 people playing one night, and a guy wrote to me and he said, Mark, I came to this movement. I didn't speak to anyone. There was no one I could talk to about my politics. I was very shy. I wasn't making friends. I joined in one of your games, met a couple of lads, we play together now every other night, and I can talk about my politics. But this guy, he's not just found somebody to walk through the streets with, pushing leaflets through doors with, or seeing once every month at the big march. He's actually got friends that he's talking to every day. That is community. driving a wedge between people in a community like that is so much harder. If you think of this in terms of, we talked about gravity earlier, now let's talk about glue. Gravity's a bit like glue, isn't it? It holds things onto the surface of an object. And as I said, the bigger the object, the more likely people are to stick to it or to be held down. So you can jump higher on the moon than you can on Earth. And, you know, if you're next to a much bigger object like Saturn or Jupiter, well, the gravity's even stronger then. Well, think of those bonds between people. The bonds between people who have shared loves that are outside of the political field, hold them together, bind them together, hold your community group together. So we do want to be active in elections when it benefits us. We don't want to be active in elections when it's throwing good money after bad. I don't want to see 400 PA candidates at the next general election so that we can all waste thousands of pounds. I'd like to stand 2 or 3 seats in the best area, save all our deposits and get reported on positively because the media are so disgusted that we got so many votes because we picked our seats carefully. Again, so what we're talking here is, first we talked about guerrilla politics, picking our battles. You can pick your battles in elections. And secondly, I talked about community and binding people together. They are 2 things that we can learn from the failures of the past, apply them to today, and ensure that we today are not making the mistakes of the past. I'll give you another example about guerrilla politics, because we'll talk a bit about the ideal. We've talked about the National Front with the military analogy. Now we'll talk about EDL. EDL had a similar military strategy to the National Front. We'll all turn up on this time at this date and we'll have a big demo. Let's think about this for a while, or for a moment, should I say. No need to think about it for too long. It was a bad idea. We know it's a bad idea. But how do we come up with a better idea? Well, I'll tell you this. What's better? And think about this for a second. If you had 400 people at your disposal, 400, what would be a better tactic? Would it be A, getting your 400 people to turn up in one town or city, announcing it in advance, facing off with the police and the left, and at the end of it, some of your people being injured, getting into a bit of a fight, having the press know that you're turning up and ready with their cameras to report on you negatively? Would that be a good idea? Or would a better idea be saying to your 400 people, why don't, instead of us telling our enemies where we're going to be on the time and the date, why don't we do something a little bit more daring? Why don't we get our 400 people and split them into 100 groups of 4? And those 100 groups of 4 all act independently. And those 100 groups of 4 all go out totally autonomously to a different area on the same time, at the same day, arrive unannounced and drop a banner at the same time on the same day. Which is the better idea? Well, obviously it's the latter idea. Because instead of having one big event, which is going to end in a fracas and trouble and violence and arrests and negative publicity, you've now got 100 different events with 4 people at each one of them, all dropping their banners peacefully, all submitting photos, all doing a bit of activism. Imagine doing that. We don't have to imagine doing that because we did this last year. On Indigenous Peoples Day, we got our people, both here in the UK and dozens and dozens of groups abroad, to go out in small groups, to do it first thing in the morning, to turn up unannounced, not to tell people where we were doing these things. It was all guerrilla tactics, as I've talked of earlier. And all of these groups, independently, all over the UK, went and held up White Lives Matter banners on the same day, Indigenous Peoples Day. And then they uploaded all the pictures to Twitter, to Facebook, to Instagram, and we've got a compilation video which is on my BitChute showing all of these pictures. And it didn't just take place here in the UK. It took place in America, in Canada, all over the continent, and even as far as New Zealand, people got on board with that. Did our enemies stop us? Of course they didn't. Could they stop us? No. Now, what happened? Well, it trended on Twitter, and Twitter was so annoyed that it was trending that they had to pull it out of the trending list. Even though it had had over 60,000 mentions, they hid it from the trending list and put rubbish in the trending list that had about 2,000 mentions, because they were so enraged by what we'd done. Because it was a nationalist victory. It was using our smaller numbers, our smaller amount of funds, our complete lack of state or establishment support, and using what we had and doing something wise with it. It was having a poor hand of cards, but playing that hand well, and making sure that our cards were so close to our chest that when we played them, our enemies didn't have a clue what we were doing or where we were doing it. And we pulled it off. And compare and contrast that event and how positive it made people feel with a boozy EDL demo of, 300-400 lads shambling through a town centre and getting into trouble, fighting with Reds and throwing cans of lager at people. It's night and day. It is night and day. So again, the guerrilla tactics for the demos can be applied. You don't have to enter into this mire of telling people where to turn up and having some boozy party attitude. You can run it like a guerrilla military operation and you will see success. And people come away elated. People come away happy. They come away knowing that they've done something productive and not getting into any trouble, not getting doxxed, not coming away with a black eye or a criminal record. This works. We've trialed it, it works, and we'll be doing it again this year. And our banner drops all over the country have continued throughout the year and got us publicity in the local press. The local press are enraged, but you know what? They can show a picture of the banner, but they can't show a picture of a drunken PA member being dragged away by the police after fighting with a Red. Because it never happened. Because the Reds never knew where we were going, and neither did the police. So we were the masters of our own destiny. We were the ones who were effectively forcing the press to report on us in the way that we saw fit. Now, the other thing about the EDL, and I've been very critical of the EDL had a problem with drinking, had a problem with drugs, had a problem with Larry sort of football lad style behaviour. 2 seconds, just need a quick drink. And the problem they had with that damaged them. When we started Patriotic Alternative, we did something that was very bold. We did something that was very different. We did something that was pretty much unprecedented. We separated politics from drinking. We separated politics from the cycle of pub meetings, from the cycle of boozy demos, from the cycle of days out on the megabus or the train where people are encouraged to drink. And we had a code of conduct. We had a dress code. We had a way that people were allowed to speak to one another. So people weren't allowed to use vulgar language. People weren't allowed to use racial slurs. People weren't allowed to behave in a loutish or thuggish manner. And people were told that if you were invited to a dinner event, if you were invited to a camp, if you were invited to a social event, and alcohol was present, if you got drunk, you'd be asked to leave. And if you were doing a physical activity the next day, so there was an evening meal at a pub followed by a hike the next day, if you were drunk or hungover at the hike the next day, you'd be asked to leave. We don't tolerate any of that. And we were very, very clear about our intentions. We were very clear about our code of conduct. And there'll always be somebody who will say to you, oh, this is tyranny. We don't want this. We won't be able to have any fun. If I can't bring my lager, I'm not coming. Tell that person to go away. Tell that person not to come. Tell that person you don't want them. Because I can tell you now, that one boozy, foul-mouthed, antisocial individual might take up a bottom on a seat. He might fill one seat at an event. But that individual will put off a dozen decent people from ever coming back. And we came up with this phrase called that guy. And that guy is the person that puts off normal people. That guy is the person who prevents normal people attending our events. Now, when we held one of the events that led to PA being founded, it was a nice meal in a quite upmarket wine bar. And one thing I noticed during this meal was we had a record number of women in attendance. We had very well-dressed, very decent, well-spoken women in attendance. And I went around the room speaking to people saying, it's great to see you here. What made you want to come to this event? And all the women said the same thing. The women said, we've come to this event, Mark, because we've always wanted to get involved with nationalism. We've always wanted to do something. But the reason we never did is because the violence, the thuggery, the drinking, that guy, the weirdo who sat at the back of the meeting with a carrier bag full of home-printed leaflets about bizarre things that go on his head, the odd fellow that acts in a strange way and makes people feel on edge. But they said when we knew that it was going to be in a nice venue and you were organising it, we thought it was going to be different, so we turned up. And we coined the phrase that guy. We didn't want that guy at the meeting. But something else these women said to me was very interesting. They said, well, one of them said to me, she said, I really like going running, she said, and I love listening to Dr. David Duke. I love listening to his podcast when I go running. And other women were talking about the books they read, the podcasts they listened to, the people that inspired them. And these women weren't scared about talking about racial politics. They weren't scared about talking about the JQ. They weren't scared about talking about ideology, nationalist ideas. They wanted to talk about these things, but they didn't want to talk about these things sat next to some smelly, poorly dressed, drunken guy who sat there burping, scratching himself, and drinking cans of lager all afternoon. They didn't want that. They wanted to sit here at a nationalist meeting and discuss these things with good people in an intellectual way in a nice environment. And nationalism has always been bereft of women. Nationalism has very rarely had large numbers of women in attendance, but I'm very proud to say that our events get around 30% turnout from women. So 70% are male, 30% are women. Why do we get such a high turnout? Because we hold our events in nice venues, we don't allow drinking, and we don't allow people just to turn up and act badly. And every time we hold an event, I will send out the code of conduct, and somebody will write to me and say, I'm not coming now. I don't want to come. First time we held a big conference, I had a guy write to me. When I sent him the code of conduct, he replied straight away, I'm not coming now. You can basically stuff it, Mark. That's it. You know, if I have to behave myself, I'm not coming. That guy did us a favour. That's why we have the code of conduct. If he can't come and sit and be polite for an afternoon around decent people, around, you know, men and women, we don't want them. And what happened the next event? Well, the next event, we went from having 100 people to nearly 200 people. And people brought their mums, they brought their wives, they brought their girlfriends, they brought family members, because they were proud to say, I'm part of this, because that guy wasn't there. That freak who puts everyone off and gets drunk and causes a scene and embarrasses himself and makes everyone else feel awkward by extension, he wasn't there. So they brought their friends and family, and it grew. And the growth, as I said, was from 100 to about 185, 190, so nearly directly doubled. It would have doubled if it wasn't for coronavirus. We held our second conference the last weekend before Britain went into the lockdown, and that was basically why the numbers, a few people just texted and said we're a bit worried about COVID, so they didn't come. But we still got an amazing turnout. Wonderful event. And it attracted the right people. It brought the right people along. So that's another message. Don't be afraid to have a code of conduct. Don't be afraid to tell people it's not a drinking session. Don't be afraid to say to people, we don't tolerate vulgar language around women. We don't tolerate racial slurs. We don't tolerate people turning up and acting in a certain manner. We also have a dress code. If you come to one of our conferences, you've got to dress appropriately. If we were going hiking together, you'd all put hiking boots on and the right gear because you want to get up the mountain together. Equally, if you're coming to a conference and enjoying a 3-course meal, you're expected to dress accordingly. Again, it filters for the right people, and you want quality people. You want people at the very core of your movement to be the kind of people that others want to associate with. I talked earlier, didn't I, about the National Front. I said originally, on those early National Front marches, the people at those marches were exceptional people. People that you would want to be associated with. People with suits, shirts and ties. People who are upstanding members of society. People who had a stake in society. That's why March and Grow initially worked. When those people stopped coming to events, when a different style of people came to events, it went to March and Shrink. Because the right people will give your party a greater gravity and suck more people in. The wrong people will be like repellent. They will put good people off and your party will shrink. It will fall to pieces. So, what have we learned so far? Well, you need to build a broad base. You need to focus on many things. You need to be involved in many different facets of politics. And politics extends everywhere. And you should be reaching out to people. And you certainly shouldn't be demeaning people for having small concerns. If somebody's concern is that they've been collecting Spider-Man comics since they were 6 and now Spider-Man's all of a sudden black and that's the reason they're getting involved, you don't laugh at them. You put them in touch with somebody who likes comics and can talk to them about it and bring them in. You don't demean people for having what you feel are small concerns. You never ever do that. You connect people on a community level. What else have we learned? You use guerrilla tactics. You never announce your arrival. You do hit and run smaller events. Rather than getting 400 people to stand off against 1,000 Reds, you get 100 groups of 4 going out and anonymously dropping banners at the same time on the same day without anyone knowing you're going to do it, and you make a huge scene. And you can say, we were in every city and town in the UK active on the same day. Guerrilla tactics, the correct military strategy. Never bang your head against a brick wall. What else have we learned? You use elections. You use elections to your benefit. You don't get wedded to this boom and bust cycle. And as we said, you realise that there's more to politics. Community is what we're building. Community first and foremost. Now, what else can we learn? Well, I believe that being just a political party, as I said earlier, is very, very flawed. We want to be an advocacy group. We want to help people. People like to get involved with active groups that are outward facing and do things to help their communities. So what else do PA do? Well, we don't just go out putting out leaflets. We do litter picks. We help people with their CVs. I spend a lot of time helping young men put together CVs so they can get a job. We help people with their problems. We give people counselling. We are there for each other. I've counselled people and put people in touch with counsellors who have had porn addictions, who've had problems with drinking, that have had all sorts of issues, and we've helped them get themselves clean. We eventually want to be a legal advocacy group. We have put people in touch with groups that help them at work in case they're being discriminated against because they're white, or discriminated against because they won't wear their COVID muzzle. All manner of reasons. We help people with their legal problems. We advise people on how to deal with the police, advise people on if they are being discriminated against, how they can take action. And this is, again, it's more than leafleting. It is community building. It is actually reaching out to people. And I can tell you this now. I've been out leafleting thousands of times. And I would say throughout my life, I have I've definitely delivered over 100,000 leaflets myself by hand. I'm not sure if I've ever pushed, I don't think I'll have delivered 1 million by hand, but I've definitely put out in my life over 100,000 leaflets by hand myself. I spent years and years doing it, 3 times a week, sometimes more a week for years. And sometimes I'd go out on my own and just do it for hours. And when you're in terraced houses, you can often get 1,000 leaflets out in an hour and a half. I can't remember a single time. I can remember people coming out of their houses and giving me thumbs up. I can remember people coming out of their houses and saying they wanted to join. I can remember people coming out of their houses and saying how could they sign up and that they would definitely vote for me. But I don't remember in my entire time of leafleting anyone ever coming out of their house and helping me leaflet. That never happened. But we did a PA litter pick a few months back, and on that litter pick, 3 members of the public saw us picking litter and asked if they could join in. And we said, yeah. We gave them high-vis vest, we gave them a bin bag, and they joined in on the spot. And 2 of them were female. That is unprecedented. Community politics, helping people, doing things that actually raise people up in a meaningful way, is far more important and far better at growing a movement than just putting out leaflets talking about a problem. You can put out leaflets all day talking about the problems of multiculturalism and immigration. That makes less of an impact than going and taking a trolley and some beer cans and crisp packets out of a pond where some swans have made their nest and then, putting them to one side for the council to collect. That makes a difference because you're actually helping people with their daily lives. That is real politics. It's not talking about politics. It's not talking about a solution if you get elected or if you become the government 6-7 years down the line. You're talking about making a change that people can tangibly understand and process right there and then. And I can tell you now, I have seen Facebook community groups praise PA for the litter picks because people are overwhelmed. They get involved on the day and they thank us for doing it. Now, one final thing, because we've got 4 minutes left until we get to 1:45 and this section of the presentation is over. I'm going to talk briefly about optics. Optics is not a matter of what you say. You can talk about pretty much anything you want. Optics is about the way you say it. And my dad always used to say this to me. He said, Mark, it's not what you say, it's the way you say it. And I like to widen that. I like to say, it's not all about the gift that's in the package. It's often about the packaging. It's often about how you wrap up that gift. And people spend, this country probably spends thousands and thousands a year on wrapping paper, on bows, on nice pieces of string to make gifts look good, to make gifts look enticing. Just like when you go to a restaurant, they plate it up well. They don't just slop it on the plate because presentation matters. Optics is basically taking a subject that is taboo, such as the JQ, such as mass immigration, such as race and IQ. And optics is packaging that subject in a way that makes it palatable to normal people. So optics is dressing well. It's addressing an audience without swearing. It's making sure your members are dressed well. It's making sure people aren't boozed up. It's making sure that people are polite. It's making sure that when people speak, they can string a sentence together. It's holding your meetings in attractive venues. All of these things are the packaging. They are the packaging that surround your core ideas. Your core ideas don't have to change. You don't have to sell out. You have to learn how to sell. And that's different. Learning how to sell is not selling out. Learning how to package your product, how to put nice wrapping paper on the gift, doesn't mean altering the gift. And that is what we need to learn. Good optics is basically good presentation skills. And when somebody says you'll get further along if you talk about other things, the EDL aren't any further along, and they're not ethno-nationalists. There are plenty of watered down groups like UKIP that fail. There are plenty of watered down groups that come over in a coarse and abusive manner. No one could really credibly accuse the EDL of being racist. because they always had plenty of people from different ethnicities at their events, but people never joined them en masse. Why? Because they actually had bad optics. They packaged what they did in a way that I said earlier, with the drinking, with the violence, with the coarse language, with the football chants. People don't want that. People want an ideology, but they want it packaged well. And I believe it's easier to sell a hardline ethno-nationalist product that it's packaged well than it is to sell something that might be on the surface, according to the media, more palatable, but is packaged in a bad way. So when you're talking about the optics debate, optics aren't about selling out. Optics aren't about dropping your core values. Any organisation that is going to be successful needs a core ideology, and organisations that don't have a core ideology, such as UKIP, that were very wishy-washy and only really stood for one thing, they fall to pieces too. You need a core ideology, but you need to learn how to sell it in a way that makes it palatable to others. And I hope that helps. I hope that gives a bit of an overview of what we did when we set up PA and how we structured the organisation to be very different from previous organisations, how we chose to sell it, how we chose to go about making tactical decisions, how we based it around community, how we reached out to other groups through ways that aren't overtly political, how we widened politics from putting leaflets through doors into a more cultural pursuit, how we reached out to people in the real world through genuine community politics that made their lives better. And I hope that gives some of you a little bit of inspiration or food for thought if you are involved in an ethno-nationalist political organisation. And I hope in some ways this short seminar will help people who are involved in political organisations and are trying to advance the cause of people of European descent. I hope it'll help those people structure their groups more effectively. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. Now we have a question session, and I would like to start with the first one. Vadå? Okay. Thank you so much, Mark. Sorry about that. I would like to start with the first question, and that is, could you say something more about Nigel Farage and the UKIP success after all?
Well, Nigel Farage and UKIP were immensely successful in certain ways, and in other ways they weren't successful. And that might be sound like a bit of a contradiction, but UKIP really rode the boom and bust electoral cycle. UKIP boomed at European elections, where they were the big issue, and they went bust in between times. So this accumulated in UKIP at the last European election that took place before the referendum, the European Union referendum here in the UK. It accumulated with UKIP actually winning the election outright, and this was unprecedented for a political party that is not really classed as a parliamentary party. To win a national election was unprecedented. And this caused the referendum to be brought about. And obviously, the referendum was then won by those who wanted to leave the European Union. So they had massive, massive success. Now, you would think, after having such incredible success, they would have gone on to be rewarded by winning seats in Parliament and becoming a major political force for change. That never happened. And it didn't happen because UKIP was a one-issue party. They all agreed on leaving the European Union. But people within UKIP had very different ideas about other politics. So you'd have people in UKIP who were multiculturalists, who wanted mass immigration, but you also had people in UKIP who believed that mass immigration was bad for the UK. So these people, other than when it came to the issue of the EU, were actually diametrically opposed. You had people who supported Thatcher and supported Thatcher's policies in the 80s, sat next to people who were the sons and daughters of miners who would have hated Thatcher and wanted Thatcher strung up. These people had nothing in common other than the fact they didn't like the European Union. So when the European Union, as the big bogeyman, as the big single issue, was taken away from UKIP fractured, it died, and it died a horrible, undignified death, because it wasn't orientated around an ideology. Now, nationalism is an ideology. We believe in many, many things. We're not just an anti-immigration party. We believe in a third economic way. We believe in many different social and cultural changes for the betterment of our people. We're united on many things. We are the only real green movement that wants to protect our environment. All of these things mean that if the immigration issue dried up tomorrow and was solved, we would still be united on other issues. UKIP didn't have that. UKIP were not united on other issues. In fact, quite the opposite. UKIP were actually disunited, and that's why the party fractured. And Nigel Farage is an interesting guy, because Nigel Farage is seen by many as the leading anti-establishment politician here in the UK. But Nigel Farage has got quite interesting credentials, because although Nigel did do great damage, and we should always thank him for this, great damage to the establishment in terms of bringing about Brexit and bringing about the referendum in the first place, when it came to not this general election that's just been, but this last general election, he refused to stand against the Conservatives in key wards. He handed victory to the Conservatives. And ultimately, Nigel Farage, he's seen as a bit of a rebel and a radical, but at the same time, he does want to be part of the establishment. He wants to be part of the mainstream. He wants a radio show on LBC. He wants to be writing columns for mainstream newspapers. We need people that want to smash the existing political system and bring about genuine revolutionary social change. And unfortunately, Nigel Farage is not one of those people. And he has had, at times, the role of almost kingmaker, where he could essentially hold the sword to both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. And he hasn't done that. He's always, in the end, done what the establishment have asked of him. And at the point where he could have led his Brexit party into a battle with both Conservatives and Labour and damaged the entire establishment, he chose ultimately to support the Conservatives and basically carry on the current establishment dichotomy of Labour versus Tory. And anyone who understands what's going on in the UK at the moment will understand that although the Conservatives say all the right things about immigration and multiculturalism, they actually are presiding over a system that is letting in more immigrants than any previous government. So Nigel Farage, ultimately, when it comes down to it, does not, unfortunately, do what is necessary to damage the establishment in a meaningful and lasting way.
Thank you so much for that analysis. And we have a question in the chat. Everyone is very, very happy with your speech. Very interesting. And one question is, do you have any tactics for university students, as these institutions often are rife with leftish ideas and activism?
Yes, I do. If you're at university, don't do anything political on campus if you're a nationalist. I got 3 pieces of advice for young Mark. If I had a time capsule and I could go back in time, my 3 bits of advice for young Mark would be: number 1, buy lots of Bitcoin when it's about £1 a coin. Number 2, don't sell all those old action figures and computer games, because they'll be worth literally tens of thousands in good condition later down the line. And thirdly, get a good education and don't do politics on campus. Nationalist politics on campus is just the excuse that the left are looking for to get good young people expelled from their universities and colleges. If you are politically minded and you are in higher education, stick to higher education when on campus. Get your degree, get your qualifications. You will serve the movement far better with them. Do politics off campus in a safe way, and don't give your enemies the ammunition they need to get you expelled. When I was at university, I wasted so much time arguing with people, putting stickers up, trying to convert people on campus. It achieved very little other than a few headlines for the party. And it stopped me getting the education I should have got. I ended up with 4 A's at A-level and got fantastic scores on all my test papers. I underperformed at university because I was constantly fighting off the left, and I was constantly doing political stuff on campus, and I was constantly having to face disciplinary procedures, protests about me being on campus. Don't put yourself through that. It doesn't gain us any support. It'll just damage your life. Make sure you focus on you. Your education is like the foundation for your future. Treat it as such, and I can guarantee you that if you treat your education in that way, it will stand you in good stead for the rest of your life. And any nationalist that tells you the opposite to what I've told you is either a fool, or they get some kind of kick out of seeing young people go through the same hell that they did. I walked that route. I was told to do that by lots of bitter older nationalists who'd wrecked their university careers. I listened to them. I thought it was going to be fun. I'm not bitter. I am quite old now, but I'm definitely not bitter. And I'm telling you this, as an older person, do not damage your education. You need it. Keep your head down, learn things, get a good job, get a good career, and get skills that can help the nationalist movement.
Thank you so much for that advice. If we continue in the chat with the questions, we have another question that says, will freedom and truth movement help us against the government making racist organizations, governments making racist organizations illegal?
I'm not really sure how to answer that question, and I'll explain why. I think I've heard of the freedom and truth movement, but I'm not completely aware of what it does, so I can't give you a proper answer because I also don't know who's involved with that particular movement, so my apologies.
Another question is, do you have any people in the UK that work full-time for nationalistic goals apart from those that work for nationalistic parties?
I'm not sure about that. Both myself and Laura work full-time for nationalism now. We subside off donations that people send us on our shows and through other means. But I'm not actually sure about other groups or exactly how many people do. If ultimately, if we want more people working for nationalism, we have to build it into a larger community to support those people. I don't know how many advocacy groups exist in the UK in total, or the total number employed full-time working for them. So sorry, I can't give a more comprehensive answer there.
Because we've noticed in Sweden that the clue question is, of course, to gather people from all types of groups, such as hunters, such as farmers, such as small entrepreneurs, such as handicraftsmen. They're usually, because they face the immigrant dangers the most, such as, you understand what I'm shooting for. And so that's one way to try to gather these forces in a nationalistic agenda. Do you have any comments on that?
Well, I think it sounds similar to what I was saying. You're trying to gather people from numerous walks of life and reach out to people on their levels. That's obviously a very, very sound tactic, and I agree with it. I think that you have to reach out to these people, talk about the issues that affect them, and they can all bring different skills and different things to the organisation, which helps it grow in different directions. I think it's a sound tactic.
Let me go back to what you started with the platforms, because that's the very hot topic that we are all craving for. I've heard rumors that there are people working really hard on this. What's the latest news that you've heard about this?
Well, I think we've got a number of platforms that we should be using. We should be using Telegram, Gab, BitChute, and Odyssey/LBRY. And those platforms are platforms that are very, very good for us. We are not going to be using YouTube. We're not going to be using Facebook. We are not going to be using Instagram. We're not going to be using Twitter. These platforms are closed to us. And that presents us with a little bit of a problem, because these are the blue ocean platforms. These are the big platforms. And I'll give you some perspective. When I was on YouTube, I had 99.4 thousand subscribers, so almost 100,000. They stopped me reaching 100,000. They froze it so I couldn't get there. So be it. I had videos which exceeded 1 million views per video. Now, put that into perspective. That's the kind of view count that a documentary would have on mainstream television after, say, 9 p.m. So good numbers. Good numbers. Reaching lots of people. Those numbers have been taken away from me. And that's unfortunate. And those numbers are going to be taken away from everyone. That's why we need to bring people to alternative platforms like BitChute and like Odyssey. I'm on those platforms and I get a fraction of those view counts now. My view counts are now, I'll do a video, 5 to 10,000 views. Now that might seem on the surface like a big reduction, but think back to my days in the BNP. If I went to a branch meeting, I'd often give a speech to 40 or 50 people. If I'd said to myself back then, Mark, you're going to reach 5 to 10,000 people every time you produce a video, I'd be like, wow, reaching 5 to 10,000 people. So it's all relative. But we can improve our numbers and we can increase our reach. And everyone can play a part in that. You see, there are plenty of normal people out there. I'll give you an example. My dad, he wants to watch my videos. So I say, you've got to watch them on Odyssey or BitChute now, mate. Send him the links. And you might have your mum, your sister, your children, colleagues, friends, who want to hear nationalist arguments. Share alternative platforms to them. We need to get more normal people onto alternative platforms. That should be one of our goals. We should help people move away from Facebook. We should help people move away from YouTube. And again, we should dominate lots of types of content and dominate these platforms. So Odyssey and BitChute should be our platforms. We should make sure we're all sharing content from there. We should make sure we're all liking content there. We're all supporting. We're all leaving positive comments. We're all watching each other's content there. And we should make sure that these new platforms, these freedom platforms, will basically be our platforms. So sooner or later, YouTube isn't just going to end with the persecution of nationalists. There will be a complete breakdown of all free speech on YouTube. They'll get rid of nationalists. They'll also get rid of conspiracy theorists. They'll get rid of people who push back against the COVID narrative. They'll get rid of people who leave negative comments about certain movies, certain actors and actresses. They'll get rid of people who are critical of political correctness in computer games and comics. They'll get rid of all manner of people who aren't completely in lockstep with the mainstream and the anti-white, politically correct agenda. And what I'm saying is, eventually, all of those people, and there are millions of them, will end up on BitChute and Odyssey. We're just there a little bit earlier. So our job should be to ensure that we prepare those platforms, that we take over those platforms, that those platforms are our ecosystems. So when all these other people finally do arrive, they're coming into our house. They're being presented with our arguments. They are subbing to our channels. We're the big boys. We're the ones there with 20, 30, 40,000 subs. So when they arrive, all of these new people looking for a new home, we're the people that own the house. That's how it should be done. We should see this not as a threat, but as an opportunity. We can't stop YouTube kicking us off. There's no way to do that. But we can take over these new platforms. We can do something about their direction. We can, we should, and it should be a priority of ours to make sure as many people move there as possible, as quickly as possible.
Eva here, a follow-up question on that very interesting speech. Have you considered marketing and market income? Because you're reaching quite an audience. And that could be very, very important money for you, and because there is a market for this.
Well, with platforms like Odyssey, you do actually see they have a cryptocurrency of their own, and you do get paid per view. You get paid per view, and you get paid via people who want to donate or people who gift you money. I suggest putting adverts on videos probably won't happen for us because any advertisers would be attacked. But by supporting Odyssey, you can actually get in on their crypto ecosystem. Now, at the moment, I think the Odyssey money is worth something like 10 cents per Odyssey token. But if you are getting thousands and thousands of views, you will get thousands and thousands of the tokens. If you get thousands of the tokens, they all add up. So by working on that platform, by having a account there, you can be part of that cryptocurrency ecosystem. And it's something I do recommend for everybody.
Right. And are you also working on getting people to build this sort of work group? Because to attract money, to work this professionally?
Yes, we are. We actually have a nationalist business group here in the UK, which helps people connect people so that we can keep money within our own community. And if you've seen the quality of our output, we do have numerous professionals on board with what we're doing. Artists, musicians, video producers, people involved in all different walks of life, all different businesses. And we are trying to professionalize things as much as we can. And hopefully, by creating this community, we are going to help new businesses that are run by nationalists to basically get embedded in our community so that we become more like, if you like, migrant groups. Migrant groups always have a large degree of in-group preference. So if you go to a Muslim area, Muslims will go to their own shops rather than the supermarket. If they need a tyre changing, they'll go to a garage owned by a Muslim man. If they need somebody looking after their children, they'll go to a Muslim childminder. They'll keep their money within their community. We need to learn from that. We need to do the same. And again, that's something we're looking towards here in the UK. And a great example of this is Laura Towler's Grandma Towler's Tea. She sells tea, coffee, other products like branded mugs, etc. Now, people need tea and coffee on a daily basis, and they don't want to buy tea and coffee from a company that supports BLM. She doesn't support BLM, she's a nationalist, so people now buy their monthly tea, their monthly coffee from her. And we need to come up with sustainable businesses like that. Businesses that aren't modelled on, well, we're going to sell a t-shirt to somebody once a year, so we need 100,000 people so we can sell 100,000 t-shirts every year. We need to sell things that people buy on a daily or weekly basis as part of their normal shop so that we can build our own sustainable businesses and substitute globalist products that are sold by big anti-white multinational corporations with nationalist products that are sold by people who support their country and love their race.
Because this is a great market opportunity. Have you any other examples of major investors that have realized this?
I think in the past there have been people who have sold music, t-shirts, branded merchandise, but to my knowledge, I think Laura is the first to produce a daily good that people use multiple times each day, every day, and take for granted and can actually now buy from a nationalist and substitute that nationalist product for one that they used to buy from a big globalist corporation. I think this is a bit of a first of a kind, or first I know of, and it's working very well. And other people are adopting this. As a group of women within the movement here in the UK that are starting to produce handmade beauty products and soap. Everyone uses soap. You use a bar of soap multiple times per day. If we can sell bars of soap, that is absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, and I also believe much in local handicraft, because they realize the value of traditions and a national market. Excellent. Is there anyone that would like to...
There might be something lost in translation there a little bit.
All right, I'll try to clarify. The point is that you have to attract people with the right language. Exactly what you told us, Mark, that you have a community focus, whereas you cannot have just a problem focus, because then you just get lost in problems. and that's something that we at Education for Future try to focus on, solutions, because in that way we can attract entrepreneurial people that want to solve things and do something actively.
I completely agree. I mean, when we talk about things, you have to be positive. A positive attitude attracts people. And if you've got a positive attitude, if you've got a positive outlook, people want to get on board with you. If you're negative, one thing that I've learned about nationalist politics is obviously that we tend to talk about things which are things that we want to stop happening. So we are negative about immigration. We are negative about multiculturalism. We are negative about the LGBT agenda. And if you're constantly talking about negatives, you can give off the aura that you are not a positive organisation, that you don't actually have anything going for yourselves, that all you want to do is to sort of stop other things. You don't want to do anything positive. And I believe that you do need an air of positivity about you. But that's where the community politics comes in that I was talking about. I said, never before have I ever had anyone come out of their house and say that they want to come and help me leaflet the street. But the first ever litter pick I did with PA, we had 3 people join us, put on the vests and start picking litter, because positive activity that enriches people's lives is a greater motivator for the general public than just a negative critique of mass immigration.
And I think those are very excellent ending words. I think you've survived very well during these 2.5 hours almost that we've kept you. I thank you so much, Mark, for this privilege. And let's see if this interview will reach 1 million views as well.
Well,
we'll try to break the record.
I just want to thank you for inviting me on. And I just want to say to people that if I have sounded a bit different than usual, I have been suffering from the flu for the past couple of days and I'm a bit bunged up. But as this was arranged, I didn't want to sort of let anyone down or sort of cancel it. So I hope I've managed to have been clear and given an interesting and thought-provoking presentation despite my slightly bunged up nature with the medical issue that I'm suffering from at the moment.
You've certainly done a very, very good job at that, and we would love to have you again in the future when you have reached even further success in the UK.
Well, thank you very much. And I'd like to thank you for inviting me. I'd like to thank everyone who's been here tonight. Obviously, I wish you guys all the best. And I hope that whatever party or organisation you represent in your homeland, that it flourishes. And as I said earlier, that you can take some of the things I've said tonight and you can apply them. And hopefully they will work out for you. And that we all move forward together, because one thing that I hear from naysayers about this movement, people say, well, why do you all work together? Why don't you just focus on what's going on in Britain or what's going on in Finland or what's going on in Sweden? And I say to people, that's a very, very short-sighted approach, because what tells you that this is a conspiracy? What tells you that there is a conspiracy afoot to rob people of European descent of their homeland or the nations they founded? This isn't an isolated problem. We as a people face identical problems wherever we live. This isn't just something that's happening in Australia. This isn't something that's just happening in France as a quirk of the French people. So the French people are embracing multiculturalism whilst the Germans are establishing an ethno-state. This isn't something that is just happening in Wales, but the English people are resisting it. This is something that is happening in every European nation, and indeed in any nation that Europeans have founded. This is a conspiracy against all of our people, and it is taking place because powerful people want to reduce those of European descent to a minority, and that is why it is very important that we as a group all work together in our respective countries and support each other as much as we can, because we all face the same fate if we're unsuccessful. And by helping each other, by sharing resources, by supporting each other in any way we can, we actually are working together to prevent that fate. We're working together for a better future, not only in our respective countries, but for all people of European descent. And I think working like this is very important. So thank you so much for inviting me tonight. I've had a really wonderful time. Thank you for asking such thoughtful questions. And to all the audience who have been here from the beginning, thank you for taking 2.5 hours out of your evening to be with us. It's very much appreciated.
Tack för att du tittade på den här videon. Kom nu ihåg att prenumerera och att klicka i ringklockan bredvid så att du får en ny video från oss så fort som möjligt.